Okay, imagine this scene. A commercial plane landing in a remote, storm-battered Alaskan airport. It touches down hard right into a strong tailwind and just won't slow down. It blows past the end of the runway, tears through fences, bounces over ground, and finally stops, kind of teetering on the edge of icy water.
Wow.
It sounds like something from a movie, but this was real. PenAir Flight 3296 in Unalaska, Alaska, October 17th, 2019.
It was a terrifying sequence of events. And, while the plane didn't actually go into the water, the impact on the ground was really severe.
Yeah.
A propeller blade ripped right through the fuselage, tragically resulting in one fatality and multiple injuries.
Initial reports might make you think, okay, classic Alaskan aviation challenges, bad weather, maybe a tricky airport pilot technique. But the pilot's immediate claim just threw everyone for a loop.
Right. He said the brakes didn't work.
Exactly. The brakes didn't work.
And that claim, well, it opened up a whole rabbit hole for the NTSB investigators. What they found was much more complex than just a simple operational error. It was like a chain reaction involving a hidden mechanical defect, one introduced years earlier, crucial decisions made under intense pressure, those challenging environmental factors, and, also systemic issues within the airline itself.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to pull apart that chain. We're going through the source material on this crash to show you how all these seemingly separate pieces came together with just devastating results.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shortcut to understanding a truly fascinating and frankly sobering case study in aviation safety.
It really highlights how many potential failure points exist in these complex systems and how they have to align just right, or I guess just wrong in this case, for a disaster to actually happen.
Absolutely. And to start, you really have to appreciate where this happened. Aviation in Alaska it's unique.
It really is. I mean, because of the sheer scale of the state, the rugged terrain, and the fact there are so few roads connecting many communities, air travel isn't really a luxury. It's often the only way to get people and supplies in and out. It's a place that historically demanded a certain kind of flying skill and, unfortunately earned a reputation for being a challenging environment.
You hear all those stories about bush pilots, sure. But by the late 2010s, these scheduled commercial airlines operating there had significantly upped their game.
Oh, definitely. They achieved safety records pretty comparable to anywhere else, really. Many years of fatality-free operations.
PenAir, or Peninsula Airways, was one of those established airlines, founded way back in 1955, right?
Yeah, family-owned for decades, had a solid reputation for a long time.
But they'd run into some trouble financially. Attempts to expand outside of Alaska, setting up operations in the lower 48, I think Boston, Denver, Portland, Oregon, too. They hadn't really worked out and left them with significant debt. So by 2017, they were in bankruptcy protection. And this ultimately led to them being acquired by Raven, Alaska.
That's right. So at the time of the crash, late 2019, that merger process was well underway. It really signaled the effective end of the PenAir brand. It was definitely a company under, immense financial stress.
Okay, so let's look at the flight itself. This was a regular scheduled PenAir Flight 3296. It went from Anchorage down to Unalaska, which most people probably know better as Dutch Harbor.
The famous fishing port, yeah. The aircraft was a Saab 2000. It's a Swedish-built twin turboprop, designed for regional routes, typically seats around 50 passengers.
And on this flight?
On this particular flight, there were 39 passengers aboard, actually included a high school swim team heading to a meet.
Wow.
Yeah, plus the 3 crew members, captain, first officer, and a flight attendant. So 42 people in total.
And the crew is obviously a critical part of this story. The captain, Paul Wells, he was 56, had a ton of experience flying in Alaska, like over 14,000 hours total.
Which sounds incredibly experienced, and he absolutely was in general Alaskan flying environments. But, and this is key, he was relatively new to the specific aircraft type, the Saab 2000.
How new?
Only 131 hours on type at the time of the crash. The first officer, Justin Lund, who was 39, he had a similar number of hours on the Saab, around the same mark.
That limited experience on the Saab 2000, that's important because it tied into PenAir's specific rules for difficult airports like Unalaska, right?
Exactly. Now, even before they left Anchorage, there was something noted during the pre-flight inspection. The first officer noticed a bald spot on the outboard tire of the left main landing gear.
A bald spot. Okay, so he brings this up with the captain.
Yes, he actually took a photo of it, showed it to the captain. They checked the company maintenance limits, which basically said a tire was okay as long as the cord wasn't showing.
And was it showing?
Apparently not. The captain reviewed it and deemed it acceptable for flight based on that specific criteria. Wasn't showing chord.
All right, so the tire is noted, but they're technically cleared to go. What about the weather forecast down in Unalaska?
Well, the briefing indicated a storm was expected. Winds were forecast 15 to 25 knots coming out of the west with broken clouds and light rain. Pretty typical for the area, but still challenging.
And you mentioned those PenAir rules for captains new to the Saab 2000. How did the wind forecast fit in?
Right. So captains with less than 300 hours on type, like Captain Wells, had specific stricter wind limits for being dispatched to certain special airports, and Unalaska was definitely one of them.
That was the limit.
The forecast wind speed plus half the gust component wasn't supposed to exceed 20 knots. The forecast they had was right at the edge of that limit.
Okay, so right on the line.
Exactly. And company procedure actually required an explicit discussion and agreement between the crew and the dispatcher for values this close to the limit, a formal acknowledgement.
But the source material suggests they decided to fly without any apparent hesitation or specific discussion about being right on that edge.
Seems that way. They just agreed to go, which, looking back, was maybe the first decision where you see them operating right at or perhaps slightly beyond that intended safety margin.
And Unalaska Airport itself, it doesn't make things easy, does it?
No, definitely not. It's built on this narrow neck of land, mountains on either side. The approaches can be quite dynamic. You've got two main runway directions, runway 13, often called the front door, and 31, the back door.
Which is easier.
Generally, runway 13 is considered the less challenging approach.
And the captain's initial plan was for 13. Even though it might mean a tailwind.
That was his preference, yes. He expected some tailwind component, but preferred that runway initially.
Okay, but as the flight went on, the winds at Unalaska started changing.
Yeah, which is common there. They shifted around to the northwest and picked up speed. That clearly started favoring runway 31, the back door. The captain even noted it on the cockpit voice recorder.
What did he say?
Something like, starting to favor the back door a little more.
So the conditions were pointing towards runway 31, but they stuck with the plan for 13.
It appears so initially. There didn't seem to be like a clear predefined trigger point for them to switch runways based just on those wind shifts. They seemed focused on 13.
But then the wind shifted again.
Yeah, closer to the airport, it seemed to shift back towards favoring runway 13 coming more from the south. So kind of confusing signals.
Okay, so they make their first approach to runway 13. How did that go?
Initially, it seemed pretty normal, but then around 300 feet above the ground, their speed and trajectory weren't quite lining up right for a stable approach. Things were a bit off.
And that's when the first officer called for the go-around.
Correct. Did the right thing. Called go-around, standard, safe procedure abort, and try again.
So after the go-around, what happened in the cockpit?
There was a moment of confusion. The captain actually suggested switching to runway 31 then. Said something like they should do a 180 and come back in.
Okay, so the captain wanted to switch. But didn't the first officer then announce something different to air traffic control?
Yes, exactly. He announced visual 13 over the radio, basically committing them to another try on runway 13.
And the captain?
The captain immediately corrected him, 3131, meaning runway 31. And the first officer sounded genuinely confused, like, I thought we were doing 13.
So who won that disagreement? Did the captain insist on 31?
This is where it gets really interesting. The captain, well, he kind of conceded. He just said, oh, okay, sure, we'll try again, agreeing to another attempt on runway 13, even though he'd just hinted he preferred 31.
Huh.
The NTSB later pointed to this specific exchange, calling it a lack of flight deck leadership by the captain, basically letting the first officer's action override his own judgment without a proper discussion about the pros and cons, given the conditions.
Wow, so a really critical decision influenced just like that. And even on that second approach to 13, the captain still seemed unsure.
That's what the cockpit recording suggests. At about 500 feet on that second attempt, he said something like, I was thinking about going the other way, meaning runway 31.
But he kept going for 13.
He did. Continued the approach.
And this is where that critical, last-minute weather update came in, right?
Precisely. Less than 2 minutes before they actually touched down, they got the updated wind check from the ground. 300 degrees at 24 knots.
Okay, 300 degrees at 24 knots. For runway 13, which is aligned roughly 130 degrees, that's a massive tailwind component.
Huge. What was the Saab 2000's limit for a tailwind landing?
15 knots.
Right. So a 24-knot tailwind made landing on runway 13, according to Saab's own guidance, completely out of the question.
How did the pilots react when they heard that number? 24 knots.
Oh, their exclamations on the CVR say it all. Things like, oh, God, shit, damn. They knew instantly how bad that number was for the runway they were aimed at.
Okay, so they knew it was way beyond limits.
Yeah.
What did they do? Did they finally switch? Go around again?
This is the astounding part. They decided to continue. The first officer said, all right, we'll try it again. And the captain agreed. All right, last try.
That's incredible. Why would they continue with the condition that makes the landing, quote, completely out of the question?
Well, this really points to a well-documented psychological factor, not just in aviation, but other high-stakes fields. It's called plan continuation bias.
Plan continuation bias.
Yeah, it's this powerful, often subconscious tendency to just stick with your original plan, especially when you're close to finishing it, even if new critical information comes in that makes that plan unsafe.
So they were just locked onto landing on 13.
It seems like it. Their focus was so fixed on completing that approach, especially after already going around once, that they seemed unable to fully process the implications of that 24-knot tailwind in the heat of the moment under stress.
That's a really important insight into, human decision-making under pressure. So, okay, they continue the approach with this massive tailwind. How was the touchdown itself?
They touched down about 1,100 feet down the runway. It's a 3,900-foot runway, so they had about 2,800 feet remaining. The tailwind component at touchdown was still around 15 knots.
Still significant.
Very. And it resulted in a really fast ground speed, 142 knots. Now, with a healthy aircraft and that much runway left, they should have been able to stop.
But that's obviously not what happened. This is where the mechanical issue really bites them, right?
Exactly. As the captain applied the brakes, that left outboard, remember the one with the bald spot the FO noted?
Yeah.
It began to skid because of the high speed and braking force.
And the aircraft has an anti-skid system specifically to prevent that kind of thing.
It does. It's designed to detect a wheel skidding using sensors. They're called wheel speed transducers. When it detects a skid, it's supposed to momentarily reduce brake pressure to that wheel. Or in this case, on the Saab 2000, it reduces pressure to pairs of wheels on that side for stability.
So if the left outboard wheel skidded, the anti-skid should have just managed it. Release pressure on that pair, maybe?
It should have. But there was a critical hidden flaw. And this dates way back to a scheduled overhaul of the landing gear components. Happened at a maintenance facility in the UK back in 2017.
What was the flaw?
The wires for the wheel speed transducers on the left main landing gear were mistakenly swapped. The wire meant for the outboard wheel sensor got connected to the inboard channel, and the inboard wire got connected to the outboard channel.
How could that even happen? How do you swap wires like that?
Well, the NTSB found a few contributing factors. The connection points weren't clearly marked to distinguish inboard from outboard. The labeling on the wiring itself was apparently confusing. And unlike on the right landing gear, the wire models weren't symmetrical on the left, which made it physically easier to plug them into the wrong spots. Just a vulnerability in the design and maintenance process.
And routine tests didn't catch this?
No. The standard system tests performed after maintenance weren't designed to detect the specific kind of wiring swap. And compounding that, the plane basically sat unused for about 2 years while PenAir was going through bankruptcy.
So this latent defect just sat there.
Exactly. It wasn't flown and tested under real-world braking conditions until that day in Unalaska.
Okay, so back on the runway, the left outboard wheels start skidding because they're going so fast with the tailwind and hitting the brakes hard.
Right. But because of the backward wiring, the anti-skid system thought the left inboard wheel was skidding instead. So following its programming, it reduced brake pressure to both inboard wheels, the left inboard and the right inboard. But of course, this did nothing to stop the outboard skid, which was the actual problem.
So the system kept trying to fix the wrong problem.
Exactly. It kept sensing the inboard skid, which wasn't really happening, and kept reducing pressure to the inboard pair until it effectively went to zero on those wheels. Meanwhile, the outboard wheel kept skidding.
So it wasn't doing anything to stop the actual skid on that outboard wheel.
Precisely. And eventually, the left outboard wheel just burst from all the skidding. The cockpit lit up with fault messages, alarms going off. They had effectively lost about 75% of their total braking capability at that point.
And that's when you hear those frantic calls on the cockpit voice recorder.
Yeah. Brakes! I got him all the way! I'm sliding! You can just hear the desperation as the reality sunk in that the plane wasn't stopping.
With minimal braking power left, they just couldn't stop on the remaining runway.
No chance. The plane ran off the end of the paved runway and onto the overrun area. The captain was trying desperately to steer right, away from the bay and towards a road that ran perpendicular.
And that's where the major impact sequence began.
Yes. They collided with a fence, went through a ditch, hit some signal posts, a road sign. The left main landing gear just collapsed under the stress of hitting the rough ground and the ditch. And crucially, as the plane went over the edge of the breakwater embankment, the left propeller struck the large stones there.
And the propeller breaking apart was just catastrophic.
Absolutely horrific. The blades sheared off with immense force and were flung forward into the passenger cabin. One of those heavy blades sliced straight through the fuselage, striking seat 4A and mortally wounding the passenger there, David Altman.
Oh.
Another blade lodged right nearby in the cabin structure. Just a tragic direct consequence of that overrun and impact sequence.
What happened immediately after evacuation?
In the cockpit, they got a fire alarm for the left engine. The captain ordered an evacuation. In the cabin, there was understandably initial panic, but reports say a chaperone traveling with the swim team did an amazing job helping restore order.
And they got out.
Passengers evacuated via the rear exits out onto the breakwater rocks, emergency response from people nearby, and the airport fire truck was remarkably fast, actually. David Altman was quickly attended to and airlifted for medical attention, but sadly, he passed away later from his injuries. 9 other passengers also sustained various injuries.
The NTSB investigation, they're known for being incredibly thorough. They didn't just stop at the event itself, right? They dug into why all these pieces aligned.
Exactly. I mean, while the initial focus might be on the crew's actions, that pilot's claim about the brakes failing was absolutely key. Their calculations confirmed that with normally functioning brakes, they would have stopped on the runway.
Even with the tire issue and the tailwind?
Yes. They had enough runway remaining, even with those factors, if the brakes had worked as designed.
So the brake failure caused by that wiring error was the direct mechanical cause of the overrun itself.
It was a direct cause, yes. But the NTSB also ran another calculation. They showed that if the pilots had chosen to land into the wind on runway 31, they would have had enough runway to stop, even with the 75% loss of braking caused by the faulty anti-skid system.
Wow. That really underscores the consequence of that final approach decision, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows how critical that choice was. But the investigation went deeper, asking why the crew was put in that difficult position to begin with. And the NTSB looked very hard at the airline's management.
What did they find there?
They found some significant issues. PenAir had specific rules for captains flying into Unalaska. You needed 300 hours on the aircraft type, the Saab 2000 in this case. Or there was a waiver process. If you had at least 100 hours on type, you could potentially get waived in with a check, airman recommendation, and specific approval from the chief pilot.
And Captain Wells, how many hours did he have when he was approved for Unalaska?
He only had 20 hours on the Saab 2000 when the chief pilot signed off on his special airport training qualification for Unalaska. 20.
20, not 300, not even 100 for the waiver.
No. It was a clear violation of the company's own established procedures.
Why on earth would they do that?
Well, the source material points directly to the pressure created by the bankruptcy and that pending merger with Raven. There was a severe pilot shortage, and management felt immense pressure to get pilots qualified quickly, especially for critical, potentially lucrative routes like Unalaska. The NTSB actually found evidence that management was sort of already operating as if a planned reduction of that Unalaska training requirement down to 100 hours was already in effect, even though it hadn't been officially approved or implemented yet.
Just pushing ahead. And this points to maybe deeper cultural issues within the airline.
It absolutely does. The NTSB report details some really concerning incidents. There was apparently a Czech airman who resigned because he disagreed with this push to fast-track pilots.
Really?
Yeah, and he reportedly faced threats from management for pushing back. There was another incident where the chief pilot and a senior VP from Raven, Alaska criticized a captain, called her unprofessional and immature, and questioned her judgment simply because she refused a flight she felt was too risky due to weather, even though it might have been technically within legal minimums.
Wow, that's exactly the kind of behavior that sends a message to pilots. Don't speak up about safety concerns if it might inconvenience management or operations.
Precisely. Pilots reported feeling this pressure, feeling that raising concerns beyond the absolute legal minimums was, discouraged. Trust in management was apparently severely eroded.
And the NTSB's conclusion on this?
Their conclusion was blunt. Sending an inexperienced captain on that specific aircraft type to a challenging airport like Unalaska in marginal weather conditions, especially under that kind of organizational pressure, They basically called it a recipe for disaster.
They also looked at the airport itself, didn't they?
Yeah.
And the regulatory side. Unalaska's runway and safety area, the RISA.
Right, the RISA. That's the clear graded area past the end of the paved runway, designed to give aircraft some room if they overrun. Unalaska's was only 300 feet long.
Which was okay for some planes.
It met the requirements for smaller aircraft like the Saab 340B, which had been common there for years. But the Saab 2000 is a larger, faster aircraft. For that aircraft category, a 1,000-foot RISA is recommended.
And Unalaska didn't meet that recommendation.
No, not even close. Only 300 feet.
And the FAA had approved Saab 2000 service there anyway, without considering that RISA size difference at the time.
That's what the NTSB highlighted. They essentially questioned the value of having safety recommendations, like the 1,000-foot RESA, if they aren't treated as important criteria when regulatory bodies approve certain aircraft operations into specific airports. What's the point of the recommendation if it's ignored?
So it really is this just perfect, terrible storm of factors. You've got a maintenance error hidden for years, a pilot decision massively influenced by psychology and pressure, a struggling airline cutting corners on training and seemingly undermining its own safety culture, and then airport infrastructure that didn't fully meet the safety recommendations for the aircraft flying in.
Yeah, all those holes in the Swiss cheese lining up at once. What happened to the airline, PenAir, and Raven after all this?
Well, the consequences were severe. Raven Alaska lost its crucial code-share partnership with Alaska Airlines, which was a huge revenue source. Already saddled with debt from acquiring PenAir, the financial fallout from the crash insurance, lawsuits, reputational damage, combined with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic hitting just a few months later, proved fatal for the company.
So they went under.
They ceased operations entirely in 2020.
And while, the pandemic was certainly a major blow to all airlines, some sources suggest that for Raven, the underlying financial weakness exacerbated by the safety issues and the crash fallout were likely the decisive factors. Other regional airlines in Alaska did manage to survive the pandemic downturn.
Right. The Raven brand name and its operating certificates were eventually acquired by a completely new company, new ownership, new management, essentially starting fresh under the old name.
Did the industry learn anything? Any changes made?
Yes. Saab, the aircraft manufacturer, updated its maintenance manuals and issued specific warnings about that potential anti-skid wiring error. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, mandated inspections of the anti-skid wiring on all Saab 2000s operating in Europe.
Okay.
And importantly, a new post-maintenance test procedure was developed specifically to catch that exact wiring swap error in the future. Can't really redesign the part since the plane's out of production, but they addressed the maintenance and testing side.
The NTSB's final conclusions from this whole case are pretty stark, aren't they? They usually are.
They really are. It's just such a powerful demonstration of how a compromised safety culture, even if it stems from financial pressure, can directly lead to tragedy and ultimately destroy a company. Even in an era where aviation safety overall has dramatically improved, they really emphasize that the old idea that maybe lower safety standards might be acceptable in challenging environments like Alaska, that era is firmly over. You can't make those kinds of compromises.
And it's such a crucial lesson for all of us, really, about risk. Those safety margins, whether it's a tailwind limit on paper or a minimum training requirement or a recommended length for a runway overrun area, they can seem abstract.
Just numbers.
Right. Just numbers or guidelines until you push past them, maybe under pressure, maybe because you've gotten away with it before. And suddenly those margins are the only thing standing between a normal day and an absolute disaster.
Yeah. This crash is just a profound example of how multiple, individually low probability failures, the maintenance error, the specific sequence of pilot decisions influenced by bias, the systemic pressure from management, how they can all align to produce a catastrophic outcome.
It wasn't just one single cause you can point to. It was that confluence, that coming together of several factors, each may be relatively unlikely on its own, happening at exactly the wrong moment.
And that's really what this deep dive hopefully shows you. The layers involved. That wiring mistake hidden for years, the crew's really difficult decisions influenced by psychology and intense pressure, the airline's management pushing limits for economic reasons, the airport's design recommendations not being met for that aircraft. It's almost a textbook example of how complex systems can fail.
And understanding this, it matters to you listening because it's a lesson that absolutely extends beyond just aviation. It illustrates how organizational culture profoundly impacts safety and performance at every single level. It shows the critical importance of questioning assumptions, of respecting established limits, even when there's pressure internal or external to cut corners. And maybe most importantly, fostering an environment where people feel genuinely safe to speak up when something just doesn't feel right.
So thinking about all those elements we've discussed today, the swapped wires hiding for years, the decision to land with that huge tailwind, the captain's training waiver being signed off improperly, the management pressure on the safety culture, the airport's runway and limitations. What single element do you think was the most crucial link in that tragic chain of events? The one where, if it had been different, maybe, just maybe, it might have prevented the entire crash. Something to consider.